This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter and more dangerous. It's about what happens when the rules don't disappear, they stay on the books. But stop applying evenly. When the machinery of government still hums, still moves money, still issues orders, but begins to recognize loyalty before law. Most people don't notice this at first because nothing explodes. No alarms sound. Life keeps moving, but underneath, something fundamental shifts, not in theory. In practice, the system starts making exceptions, then patterns, then habits. And once that happens, the damage doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in pieces, distributed, normalized. If you're watching closely, you can feel it now. A kind of institutional vertigo. Stay with me. Because the story isn't what was said. It's what quietly started being treated as optional. And once something like that becomes optional, it doesn't stop on its own. What actually controls a system like this is not ideology. It's leverage, not speeches, not elections. Leverage, money that moves or doesn't, permits that clear or stall. Funds that arrive or quietly don't. On paper, none of this has changed. The laws are still there. The budgets still pass. The agencies still exist. But control no longer comes from writing the rules. It comes from deciding when the rules apply. That's the shift. Power migrates away from legislating outcomes and toward managing exceptions. Who waits? Who gets fast-tracked? Who is told the paperwork is suddenly incomplete? This is how a system learns obedience without ever saying the word. Because when access replaces law, everything becomes conditional. Not officially, operationally. And that distinction matters. Because once enforcement becomes selective, the system stops being neutral, even if it still looks neutral from the outside. And here's the unsettling part. This kind of control doesn't require chaos. It requires calm. And that calm is exactly what allowed the next shift to go unnoticed. There was a time when federal power moved the same way everywhere. Slow, bureaucratic, predictable. You could argue with it, challenge it, appeal it. And even when you lost, you knew why. That's no longer the experience. Now, the change doesn't come as an announcement. It comes as a delay, a pause, a review that never quite finishes. Before, funding flowed because the law said it should. Now it flows because nothing stops it. And that sounds similar until you realize how fragile that is. Because when motion depends on permission, permission can be withdrawn without explanation. This is how systems slide. Not by overturning rules, by quietly reinterpreting silence. What once required justification now only requires discretion. And discretion, when it goes unchallenged, becomes power. The most dangerous part of this shift is how easy it is to normalize. After a while, people stop asking why. They start asking how long. And that question, how long, is what sets up the first visible rupture. Then the system slipped, just enough for people to see it. Money that had already been approved, already allocated, simply stopped moving. Not everywhere, not randomly. Entire categories of funding froze. Clean energy, childcare, social services, billions of dollars authorized by law, suddenly treated as optional. And when asked why, the explanation wasn't technical. It wasn't procedural. It was political. That was the shock. Not that funds were delayed. That happens. But the delay followed a map, a voting map. Places that complied were untouched. Places that didn't were told to wait until a court stepped in and said no. Bluntly, illegally withheld. Stop immediately. The ruling didn't fix everything. It didn't punish anyone. It just forced the money to move again. But the damage was already done. Because the message had been delivered. The system had shown what it was willing to try, And once a government attempts something like that, even unsuccessfully, it doesn't disappear. It adapts, and the next mechanism is harder to see. If this matters to you, keep watching. Because what followed wasn't a retreat. It was refinement. This is where the system reveals how it actually works. Not through laws, through timing. Funds don't vanish. They slow. Permits aren't denied. They're reconsidered. Projects aren't canceled. They're reviewed again. And again, on paper, nothing illegal happens. In practice, everything changes. Because the people who benefit from this system are never the ones waiting. They're the ones with access. With allies inside the process, with calls that get returned, and the damage doesn't land on institutions. It lands on everyone downstream. States waiting on infrastructure money, families waiting on childcare support, communities waiting on energy projects that were already underway. The cost gets absorbed quietly. Delayed paychecks. Paused construction, services stretched thinner. No announcement is required. No justification offered. The system just shrugs. And when challenged, the response is always the same. Implementation discretion, administrative flexibility. That phrase does a lot of work because it turns obligation into preference and preference into leverage. And once leverage replaces law, the system stops asking what is required and starts asking who can be pressured. That's the mechanism. And it doesn't stop with money. It moves next to something even harder to defend. Now it speeds up. Projects already underway are suddenly paused, not debated, paused. Work stops. Crews wait. Deadlines slip. Grants are pulled back, not because of performance, because of criticism. Election support is questioned, not on security grounds. On compliance, each move is small. Each one has a memo, a rationale. Taken alone, none of this looks catastrophic. Together, it's a pattern. Courts start seeing it too. Again and again, blocked, illegal, enjoined, multiple rulings. Same answer, stop. But the system doesn't collapse under these losses. It recalibrates. It learns where resistance is fast, where it's slow, where silence buys time. And while the legal fights stack up, the real effect happens elsewhere. In the waiting, in the uncertainty, in the cost of never knowing if the rules will hold tomorrow. That uncertainty is the point, because fear doesn't require victory, only unpredictability. And that's when the damage stops being administrative and starts becoming personal. This is where it reaches you, not as a headline, as a disruption. A program you rely on pauses. No warning, no explanation that makes sense. A project in your community stalls. Jobs slow, timelines stretch. You're told it's temporary, under review, being evaluated, but the review doesn't end. And the silence feels intentional. You start budgeting differently, planning differently, expecting less, not because the law changed, because the system became unreliable. And that's the shift most people feel before they understand it. When trust erodes, you compensate. You adapt. You lower expectations. That's how power settles in, without resistance. If this feels familiar, if you've felt that quiet recalibration in your own life, pay attention, because systems don't break by collapsing. They break by training people not to expect protection. And once that training takes hold, it spreads faster than any policy. Stay with me, because this doesn't stop at borders. It doesn't stop at states. What happens next is what turns a domestic imbalance into something much larger. Once systems like this destabilize internally, they don't stay contained. Because unpredictability doesn't just affect citizens, it affects partners, markets, allies watching from the outside. Projects tied to international investments stall. Energy timelines slip across borders. Commitments, once assumed, start carrying risk premiums. Not because the resources disappeared, because reliability did When a government demonstrates that rules can bend by preference, every agreement becomes provisional. Foreign investors hesitate. Allies hedge. Institutions that rely on continuity start building workarounds. And that creates a quiet shift in gravity. Decisions that once flowed through formal channels begin routing around them. Not out of hostility, out of caution, because no one wants to be dependent on a system that may suddenly reclassify them as optional. This is how domestic leverage turns into global signal. And once that signal is sent, it can't be unsent. The system is no longer judged by its laws, but by its volatility. And volatility in a global system doesn't stay abstract for long. It accelerates. And the next phase is where choices narrow. From here, the system has three paths, not outcomes, paths. The first is adjustment. Institutions adapt, courts intervene faster. Congress tightens controls. The damage is contained, not undone, but limited. The system survives by hardening, becoming slower, more defensive, less flexible. The second path is erosion. Nothing snaps. Nothing formally breaks, but enforcement becomes uneven enough that the law stops feeling real. People plan around instability. States hedge. Institutions protect themselves first. Power concentrates quietly in whoever controls the choke points. The third path is rupture. Not dramatic, procedural. One delay too many. One funding cutoff that doesn't get reversed. One election dispute that lingers. And suddenly the assumption that someone will stop this is no longer safe. These paths don't announce themselves. They overlap, they blur. You can be on more than one at the same time. And right now, the system hasn't chosen, which is what makes this moment dangerous. Because acceleration doesn't require intent, it only requires momentum. And momentum is already building. Nothing in this story ends cleanly. There is no final ruling that restores what was lost. No vote that permanently locks the door. Systems like this don't fail all at once. They teach people to live with less certainty, and then they move on. What you're watching isn't collapse. It's conditioning. A government learning what it can attempt. Institutions learning how fast they have to react. People learning what not to rely on. That learning doesn't stop when the headlines do. So the question isn't whether this was legal. Courts answered that. The question is what happens after something illegal is attempted often enough that it starts feeling familiar. Because familiarity dulls resistance. And the next time the line is tested, the response window may be smaller. If you want to understand where this goes next, how systems respond when containment becomes permanent, stay with us. Because the danger isn't that the rules are gone. It's that everyone is learning which ones might not be there tomorrow.